In her new book, the scholar Marion Gibson tells a 700-year history of witches and witchcraft by taking readers through the stories of 13 witch trials. She includes the ones you would expect, like in Salem, with the outcomes you would expect, concocted evidence, coerced confessions, executions. But Gibson begins the book with the story of one woman accused of being a witch who actually wins her trial. This was in 1485. The woman was Helena Scheuberin.
She lived in Innsbruck in the Austrian Alps, and she was just going about her business. She had a mind of her own. She was probably quite outspoken, and she was quite respected in her community. She was the wife of a respected merchant. She was quite wealthy, and she had some access to education. But Heinrich Kramer, a demonologist, a Dominican monk, comes to her town. And he does that because he wants to hold a witch trial. He's been thinking about the idea of witches for quite some time, and he's become convinced that the world is full of them. And it's his job, he thinks, as a Dominican monk and inquisitor, to get rid of these people. And when he arrives in Innsbruck, he decides that Helena is one of them. She's his first suspect. And I think that's partly because she resists his coming to town. As soon as he gets there, she cottons on to what it is that he's there for, and she starts attacking him. She hears him preach sermons about witchcraft, and she says, you don't talk about anything other than witchcraft. This is ridiculous. And you tell these absurd stories about what the women who think are witches can do. And I think that's heretical. I don't think that's godly at all. And so Heinrich decides to accuse her as a heretic and a witch. And he takes her to a witch trial along with 6 other women. And one of the things he asks her is, were you a virgin at the time of your marriage? And Helena refuses to answer that question, which is quite a bold thing. This is a really powerful churchman. He's come from somewhere else. He says he has all the authority of the Pope behind him, and he can have her tortured. And yet, this woman, who's so talkative on other occasions, makes a sensible and brave decision to keep silent. And she goes out of court and gets herself a lawyer. And she comes back and she challenges Heinrich in his own courtroom. And by the end of the trial, things have been reversed. And Helena has done something amazing. But Heinrich does go away from that witch trial feeling pretty bruised, and he sits down and he decides to commit his horrible demonological ideas. So demonology, the study of demons, but also the study of witches. And he puts them into a book called Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, and it becomes very widely read across Europe. So actually the trial, although it ends comparatively well in comparison with most witch trials anyway, it has these horrible long-term consequences, and it spawns more witch trials, which is really the theme of the rest of the book.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Marion Gibson's book is Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials. And she begins with the most basic question, just what is a witch? But before you can get there, you have to ask another question. What is the force witches are said to use? That is, what is magic?
Magic is the big underpinning force that makes sense of a lot of the world for people in the 15th to 18th centuries, say, that the big period of the witch hunts. And at the beginning of that time, people often think of it as either good or bad magic. So they may very well accept that people can do witchcraft and they can use magic in a bad way against their neighbours, or they can create storms, or, they can influence the natural world, things like that, by magic. But during the period of the witch trials, it becomes increasingly difficult to hang on to the view that there is bad magic and good magic. Before that, people thought, well, yes, there is bad magic in the world, but there's also healing magic. There's religious magic. Religion and magic they thought of as being quite intertwined, actually. But demonology, Heinrich Kramer's type of demonology, untangles the two types and says, well, good magic doesn't really exist. There's religion, but that's not really good magic. That's something completely different. And look, there's bad magic. This is witchcraft. We need to drive this out of the world. So the 15th and 16th centuries are a period when people are thinking about magic and the way that it underpins everything that they know about the world, but that understanding is changing and they're becoming more and more focused on finding bad magicians and ultimately killing them.
So demonology and the study of demonology, what is it? I think you've described it as kind of as a conspiracy theory.
It is. It was kind of helpful to think about it in those terms. And as I went through writing the book, the more I thought about how there are resonances in our own time. It's a book that covers about 700 years of history. Yeah. And the more I looked at the older histories, which I was pretty comfortable writing about as a historian, the more I thought we have to bring this up to date. We have to tell the story in ways that make it resonant for people today and make them see the ways in which the idea of the witch and the idea of demonology is resonant, is relevant in their own world. So, yes, demonology was a conspiracy theory, rather like some of the ones that we see around us today. It suggested that there was a very broad group of people in society, most of whom were women, who worshipped Satan, who were entirely devoted to his service, and had decided to destroy the Christian church and to start by destroying some of their neighbours and then move on to a kind of wider assault on human society, if you like. And it portrayed them as people who not only worshipped Satan, but also did terrible things like cannibalism. They killed babies, they roasted children and ate them. They did all the kinds of classic things that conspiracy theories throughout human history have suggested that people might do if they're just utterly inhuman. So as demonology grew and grew in the 15th and 16th centuries, that kind of idea of humanity as either very good or very bad spread with it. And I thought that was something that was worth exploring over the long period of human history, if you like.
Kramer is, you mentioned, fascinated by this idea of demonology from a young age. But, of course, he's a celibate monk. So what does he know about women? What were his ideas about women? Because you mentioned in the book he had this kind of hypothesis that female witches hated men. They wanted to castrate them. So what were his ideas that were informing all of that?
Yes, I think that's a very good question indeed, and it does make you think about what it might have been like to have been brought up in an almost entirely male community as a celibate among other celibates, people who really didn't have that much contact with women at all and knew very little about them. And I think it would be quite easy in that community to develop a suspicion about women, a fear about them, particularly if you're raised on biblical stories which tend to emphasise the sinfulness of women. Eve, for example, and see women as the root of an awful lot of the evil in the world. So I can actually quite sympathise with Heinrich. I can imagine that being brought up in that world, he might very well reach a position where he's thinking, you know what the problem is with our world? It's women, isn't it? That's what it is. And therefore going on to identify them as witches. But of course the outcome of that is so terrible and kicks off these tremendous series of witch trials which run all across Western Europe and then come to America, to the supposedly new world, when the settlers go there in from the 1620s onwards, really. It has such terrible consequences that you can really only condemn it and see him as a monstrous person rather than the idea that he had, which was that women were the monstrous people in the world.
It's interesting, too, you mentioned how there comes to be this either you're a good Christian or an evil one set against the church. That comes about because the church itself is starting to split. And you mentioned how this kind of hatred starts to grow, and it becomes okay to basically kill your fellow Christians because you didn't just disagree. They were not just disagreeing with your theology, they were possessed by the devil and should be taken from the earth, I guess.
It's a terrible thing, isn't it? And, I think anybody who has any interest in Christianity or any kind of faith would look at that and think, but that's the absolute antithesis of what religion is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about love and mercy and care for one another and community and communion. It's supposed to be all of those kind of things. And actually, what demonologists did was pervert this into a religion which was just this kind of binary of on the one hand, God's good people, us, and on the other hand, Satan's terrible people, them, who we must drive out. And I think it does come from that sectarianism that starts off in the late Middle Ages when the Catholic Church splits in half and the people who are protesting against it become the first Protestants. And those two groups just cannot reconcile. They cannot live with each other in this period. So there are religious wars and people are tried for heresy and people are burned at the stake. And all these astonishing inhuman acts are perpetrated in the name of Christianity. And I do think that the witch trials come out of that, yes.
So we talked a little bit about that first story you tell in the book, the trial of those 6 witches, among them Helena Scheuberin. This, of course, the story of, in this case, a woman who basically talks back. She challenges the witch hunter. And it's interesting in the story, the people in her community, or many of them anyway, they believe her. They seem to choose rationality. They believed her trial was unjust and superstitious. And how do you explain how that happened in this situation and what happens in other situations where it seems very few women dared or had the resources to push back? Was this just sort of an anomaly that people behaved? We have a sense that these people were a mob, hysterical mob, but maybe that's not the way it always worked.
I think we do often see them, in films, for example, they're often portrayed as a pitchfork-bearing, torch-bearing mob, aren't they?
Yeah.
Bearing down on the witch in order to hysterically tear them apart. And I'm sure that there was an element of that because that is the way that crowds sometimes behave when they think they've found a terrible enemy of humanity. But I don't think the witch trials would have gone the way they did if it wasn't for a wider community investing in them. And those were, intelligent people, often the most educated in their society, people who were rational, as clever as we are today, no different, no stupider, and people who had a certain level of wealth and were kind to animals and kind to their neighbours, and yet they believed that there were witches in the world and that it was often their religious duty and sometimes their human duty to search them out and get rid of them. I do think that makes us think about the ways in which a conspiracy theory can gain traction in a wider community and make them act in ways which in other circumstances they really wouldn't consider. I think that's quite important. And Helena was lucky. She was lucky that she had a certain amount of power in her own society, so she was quite wealthy. She seems to have been quite educated. She had her own religious views. Her neighbours trusted her to some extent. Some of them surely accused her, and we know that they did. But a wider group of them must have thought, but that's Helena Scheuberin. I don't think she can be a witch. And, these other women, well, maybe they're not witches either. If she's not a witch, are they witches? Shouldn't we look at this a little harder? So she gets the support of some of the local church officials who are quite annoyed that Heinrich Kramer has come to town and is telling them what to do in their own religious community. And I think to that extent she is lucky. She's there at the beginning of the witch hunts when people are often surprisingly ready to fight and to talk back. But as time goes on, it does get harder. And also the accusations of people, when they move down the social scale, which they do in the kind of mid-period of the witch hunts, they find victims who are much more vulnerable. People who don't have education, don't have wealth, have their community against them from the start. So, maybe they have an illegitimate child. That's something that often comes up in the course of a witch hunt, or maybe they have a disability, or maybe they are somebody who's argued with a lot of neighbours and people see them as problematic. And those people really don't stand the same chance as Helena did. They're often just washed away by the the witch hunt, and they don't have the opportunity to fight back. So I think every witch trial is different.
I want to ask more about the poor women who were particularly vulnerable, as you say. That they were kind of uppity, I guess, or perceived that way by some. They were particularly assertive. They may have had, a strong personality, and so they were seen as suspect. But they also had these unusual beliefs or practices, like they were healers, basically. Talk a little bit about that part.
Yes, quite a few of them were. So the first American case that I look at, for example, a woman called Joan Wright, who was accused in Virginia in the 1620s, very shortly after people arrived on America's East Coast. She was a midwife, and she fell out with her community when she wasn't given a midwifery job that she wanted, and it went to somebody else. But sadly, the baby that she would have been delivering had she got the work later becomes ill and dies. And people turn against her. And they also seem to have turned against her because she was somebody who had views of her own. She thought that she had certain religious or divinatory abilities. So she said to people in her community that she could tell who was going to die out of a pair of husband and wife. She said that she was able to tell, like a fortune teller, who was going to die first, and she was able to see into the future in certain ways. And of course, this is kind of a useful skill in a society where things like inheritance matter a great deal, and at the same time, it's also something that's really problematic because nobody wants to be told it's going to be you that dies first and your wife is going to inherit everything, and then she'll probably remarry, and, nobody wants to hear that. Right. So I think she made herself unpopular in a number of different ways, but one of those ways was just simply by being quite a useful person in her community, somebody who could deliver babies, somebody who could provide health care. And it's a surprising thing, isn't it? You wonder why people who were actually quite good citizens would get accused of witchcraft. But it happens to Joan, and it happens to a lot of other people in this period as well.
Marion Gibson, she's a professor of Renaissance and magical literatures at the University of Exeter. Her latest book is Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials. People in the so-called New World figured they were casting off the old one when they sailed here. But you mentioned in the book with a witch trial that had, and we'll talk more about the racism there and misogyny, of course, and persecution. Those same dynamics happened here too, exactly like in old Europe. I guess the same things just translated to the new place.
They did. It's another real shame, isn't it? Yes, these people set out often with very high ideals. And what did they do? One of the first things they did was start to hold a series of witch trials. And quite often they did suck indigenous peoples into those trials. So at Salem, as I expect you know, the first person to be accused is a Native American woman, Tiba. Yeah. I've renamed her Tiba in the book because what I've tried to do is give her back a name which is something more like the name which she appears in earlier and later records. So again, I tried to give her back some of her individuality, but people will know her as Tiba. And she's a Native American woman, probably a Native South American woman. And I don't think it's a coincidence that she's the first person to be accused. She stands out in her community in all the ways that we've talked about with other people, but also just because she looks different, she sounds different. Maybe she speaks a different language. Maybe they believe that she has different religious beliefs to them, and so on. So I think difference is really, really important here. And of course, when people came to America and set up the colonies on the East Coast, one of the first things they encountered was a really sharp difference. And in the witch trials, they did not handle this well.
Well, maybe talk a little bit about the circumstances for Tiba. She's forced into a confession, but it's all in the context of – one of the things you do is you really focus on her sort of backstory as a way to sort of frame what's going on. this is the way you tell the story of the Salem witch trials, is mostly through her perspective. So talk a little bit about what's happened to her and how it comes to probably make some kind of sense that she confesses these horrible things.
I really did want to tell this story a bit differently because it's a very famous story, but it's often told, I think, from the perspective of the witch hunters. Yeah. And I thought it would be useful to tell it from the point of view of one of the first people to be accused. So what we think, and it was a scholar called Elaine Breslaw in the 1990s who discovered this, we think Tituba Tatuba is the same person as a child called Tatuba who was enslaved in Barbados in the 1670s. There isn't anybody else of that name, as far as we can tell, in all the histories that people have looked at. So, because we know that Samuel Parris, with whom Tituba lived when she moved to Salem Village, was from Barbados, because we know he owned enslaved people there, and he held land there and he was a businessman there, it seems perfectly reasonable to deduce that that is our woman. There she is as a child, an enslaved child, a terrible thing. And she's picked up by Samuel Parris and she's brought to Massachusetts with him. So she moves from Barbados, presumably having been captured on the South American mainland once and brought to Barbados and then shipped north to Boston, where the Parrises lived for a while in the early 1680s. And then Samuel Parris gets a job as the minister of Salem Village. So out they go to Salem Village and set up there. And there, I think, Tituba Tatuba must have stuck out. She wasn't even like the native peoples who lived there, so they must have seemed as different to her as she did to them and she did to the settlers. It's a really complicated social ethnic picture, but I think she stood out in that society in ways that made her vulnerable. And I can imagine that she would easily have been persuaded to confess, because if she's our girl from Barbados, imagine what a difficult life that person has had. From the very outset of her life, people have taken away all the rights that she had, abused and coerced her, forced her to work for them, probably punished her harshly if they thought that she transgressed in any way. Made her convert to Christianity from whatever it was that she'd previously believed, and told her endlessly about sin and the devil and how she was a different person from the good Christians, and that perhaps she was kind of the gateway of the devil into their community. So it's really easy to imagine that once she's put in a situation where she's being questioned by the colonists, and, it's a hot, crowded room, we have some really good descriptions of the conditions under which people were questioned during the Salem witchcraft trials, and people are shouting at her, and the people who she's supposed to have bewitched are having fits on the floor. No wonder she confesses that she is a witch, and from that, the whole thing kicks off.
I hope it's not too much of a spoiler for people that she does survive the witch trial. She's freed from prison, but it's a shame we don't know what happens to her. I mean, she's freed from prison, but we don't know if she gained her actual freedom either, do we?
No, we don't. And like a number of stories in the book, I do have to leave that one open. Yes, as far as we know, she was freed, in that her prison bill was paid by someone, and that implies that she was therefore freed. But it would be wonderful. I mean, maybe one day somebody will turn up a record. You can never rule that out. Look at Thomas Jefferson. He had those records at home all the time, and people didn't know they were there. So you never know. Somebody may one day find out what happened to her. But I also think it's important to notice the gaps in history. That wasn't written down because people didn't care. Or if they did, they were embarrassed and ashamed about what had happened and her history. And I think noticing those gaps in history is really important. Where are the stories that we don't normally tell? Could we go research them and tell them? Is it possible to find out any more? I found out an awful lot about the people who were accused of witchcraft during the course of writing this book that I think previous historians had thought we couldn't know. You wouldn't be able to find that. Nobody would have kept a record of that. Or if they had, it wouldn't be in this place. And it's actually quite instructive to go and look at new groups of records, even if it's like land records, or it's maybe a house deed or something that people haven't really thought to look at. And you're like, there she is, there's the suspect. Now I know a bit more about her. Now I can imagine a bit more about what her world might be like. So maybe one day somebody will turn up a record of her. I would love that.
There's this absurd scene in the Monty Python film The Holy Grail where this mob, of course, is trying this woman they've accused of being a witch. And of course, they go through that kind of absurd logic to get to the conclusion they were, looking for. And it made me wonder, were some of the tests that people used in the Middle Ages or in past times, were they actually that preposterous? I mean, you've heard of the practice of you dunk an accused witch in the water. If she sinks or drowns, she's innocent. If she floats, she's a witch. Is that a myth? Is that true?
Alfred, it's true. Yeah, it's disappointing, isn't it? There's a case in the book that I talk about in northern Norway, which again is another indigenous person being accused, this time from the people who lived around the Arctic Circle. And this poor woman, they throw her into the sea, the ice-cold sea in northern Norway in early spring to see if she sinks or floats. And if she sinks, they will conclude that she's an innocent person. They did pull people out. Yeah. I think one thing people often think is, they just left them to drown. And it was great being innocent, but you're also dead. But they did try and pull people out if they sank. It doesn't really help an enormous amount, does it? But it does at least mean that there is some attempt to save the life of an innocent person. But of course, if somebody floated, and this woman, Kari, Edith's daughter, she floated, they were then judged to be a witch. There was usually some kind of other trial as well. I mean, a lot of the processes I look at in the book, they're just kind of bog standard judicial processes of their time. So people do go to court, they are judged by an expert judge or a jury, or a panel of people judges them in some way, whatever the local system is. So she went through that trial as well. But people put a surprising amount of weight on this evidently ludicrous test of whether or not she was a witch or not. And the logic that they had worked out with regard to this water test, this swimming ordeal, was that God had made water, and it was water that was used in baptism as well. So therefore, if the water rejected somebody and they floated on top of it, that must mean they were a wicked person, and therefore they were probably a witch. So you can see they're trying to think about it in a logical way. They've tried to think up an explanation for why this might be, but it's just completely inadequate, neither scientific nor properly religious. And yes, I'm afraid it's not a myth. People did do these kind of tests all the time.
There's another one of the stories you tell in the book, which I wanted to ask you about, because it brings us to a king, King James. This is the trial of the North Berwick witches. King James of Scotland, we don't need to talk too much about him. I, like you, would rather sort of focus on the women caught up in this. But say something about him because, well, first of all, he just seems incredibly paranoid. And he writes this book that has some influence. Talk a little bit about his role here.
Yes, he's a little bit like Heinrich Kramer, who you talked about earlier. James is brought up in a very unusual way. He becomes King of Scotland when he's just a baby of a few months old, because his mother has been deposed on suspicion of murdering her husband, which she probably did. And so she's taken away from him, and he's left in the care of this group of nobles who just cannot stop feuding with each other over who has control of him. You can imagine being brought up in that sort of environment, how somebody might easily become incredibly paranoid. People attempted to poison his guardians. In some cases, they succeeded. He was kidnapped. People tried to murder him. They tried to replace him with other members of his family. So by the time he was in his 20s, in the 1590s, it's not really that surprising that he thinks everybody's out to get him, and he thinks in part that witches are out to get him as well as other nobles. So he decides that his cousin, the Earl of Bothwell, has used a group of witches to plot against him. And he might not be entirely wrong. I mean, certainly there are cases, as there are throughout human history, there are cases in Scottish history where people did employ astrologers and potion brewers and poisoners and other people as part of their intervention in royal politics. But it seems kind of unlikely that the people that he focuses on here, in this case a woman called Annie Sampson and a younger woman called Gilly Duncan and a whole group of other people, really quite poor people, from the villages around Edinburgh, it seems kind of unlikely that they have formed the kind of conspiracy that he believes they have, and that they're working with the devil to topple him off the Scottish throne. But that's where he gets to as a result of being brought up in this very paranoid atmosphere.
Annie's healing, I think maybe Gilly's too, they were traditional healers, right? And also, I guess in the same way that Joan was, pretty useful to that community, right?
Yes, I think so too. Yes, they're exactly in that mould of the person who is a healer or uses magic in ways that they think are benign. And we actually have some of the spells that Annie says that she used in her healing. And ironically, what they are is versions of Christian prayers and the Christian creed that people would recite in church. So she probably thinks of herself as a kind of holy woman, a mystic, somebody who's got these special powers and can use them to help people in her community. And she would recite these prayers over sick people. And if she came to a stop in the middle of the prayer, maybe she forgot the words, or somebody came in and interrupted her, or she started to cough, or it could be anything, she would conclude that there was something terribly wrong with this person, that they would probably die. But if she was able to complete the prayer and, the efficacy of the prayer washed over the person who was sick, they would probably be healed. And I think she probably believed that. She said that she'd inherited her powers from her father. And Gilly was somebody rather like her, who again had this reputation as a healer. It's become a bit unfashionable among historians to talk about witches as midwives and healers. But when you look, there are actually rather a large number of examples of these kind of people. I think Annie and Gilly really do fit into that mould.
Why out of favour?
Because it seems to people, I think, as kind of too simple an explanation. And it was something that, in particular, feminist writers talked about in the 70s and 80s. And maybe it was a bit overdone at that time. But certainly the records I've looked at, I think that's a story worth telling, and I think that's evidence worth looking at. It's also a little bit unfashionable to bang on as much as I do about how most of these people were women. That's the kind of thing that you do find in popular history all the time. And I think actually it's true. We know that 75% at least of the people accused in all the records that historians have looked at across all the jurisdictions are female. And yes, there are places where men are in the majority, but there are also places where 90%, 100% of those accused are female. And that really matters. So I think it's great to look for other explanations, but it's important not to write off this explanation as being too simplistic, because I just don't think it is. I think this is driven by misogyny, and it's driven by a fear of female healing, female mysticism, the words that women speak, the way that their bodies work, the way that they can help other women. And I don't think we should shy away from that. I think it's still really relevant to talk about this issue.
Marion Gibson, her new book is Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials. So you pop an intermission into your book, which I think is great, where it's sort of a transition here. And this is where, I guess, doubt about the witch trials of the past starts to creep in. You mentioned, for example, I think it's here in the U.S. by the mid 1693 or something like that, like 200 people are awaiting trial, for being a witch. And you say a lot of citizens, and I think this is in Massachusetts, that's right, they started to realize, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Maybe this isn't right. What's going on at this point in time?
Yes, I think it's something that starts with earlier witch trials, but it very much happens at Salem too. There's such a huge number of suspects that people do start thinking, hang on, not all of these people can be witches, surely.
Yeah.
particularly Goody so-and-so, who is my neighbour, but, on top of her, I just don't believe there can be 200 people, a very small community, who are witches. So things do start to change throughout the later 17th century. And my intermission takes place really in that bit between the 17th and early 18th centuries, when people are starting to worry that they've got things wrong. And they start thinking that perhaps all the witch trials that they have held were in some way mistakes, which of course is now something we would accept and look back on and really own that, that yes, they were mistakes. But at the time, it is very hard for people to get to that position. And they get to the position of not believing so much in witchcraft through, to some extent, the growth of modern science. So they start looking for other explanations, medical, meteorological, for things that are happening in the world around them. They don't always find them. This isn't a sudden conversion to modern science. Right. But they start thinking, well, at least we ought to look for other explanations. So we ought to experiment and try to reason our way out of this belief. And religion gets more tolerant in some ways. People have been through the horrendous civil wars across Europe in the 16th to 17th centuries, a lot of which are motivated by religion. And at some point, people just start thinking, we really cannot be killing each other in this way because we are members of different sects. We really cannot be doing this.
And they also seem to be asking themselves, can we adjudicate something like this in a court of law? So it seems like they were beginning to make a distinction between the religious part of society and the part that you could actually, judge through a legal process, I guess.
Yes, I think that's right. I think they do. I think they start thinking that these things are better reasoned out philosophically. Almost in laboratories, if you like, or in churches, but not in a law court. It doesn't seem anymore like it's the right setting. And it's partly lawyers who lead the change in society's expectations and people's belief or not in witchcraft, because they're worried about the evidence. They're really not convinced anymore by the evidence that they're bringing forward. And it's very often judges and lawyers who start arguing, I'm not really sure there are witches. And if there are, people quite cunningly work out a position whereby they can say, well, of course, the Bible does mention witches. So therefore, it must be possible for there to be witches. But we don't think in this particular circumstance in our community that this woman or this man is a witch. So they find ways of changing their opinion, of changing legal practice over time. And so by the mid-18th century, people stopped holding witch trials, certainly in the numbers that they used to. But one of the things I try and do in the second part of the book is say, but they still did carry on believing in witchcraft quite often. Yeah. And sometimes people were still killed because somebody thought that they were a witch. And today across the world, we still see a very large number of witch trials happening. So these may have stopped in Western Europe and North America. But the idea of the witch trial doesn't go away. It just kind of goes underground, and I think it comes out in other ways in society.
Well, you write a new type of witch trial, comes about, but the enemy within, that's how you put it, remained. Talk a little bit about that, because you say people still needed scapegoats, politicians still needed enemies. And in fact, I think you've said that calling someone a witch made them a useful enemy, I think is how you put it, right?
I think it does, yeah. I think the word witch doesn't lose its power, unfortunately. Yeah. Once you've invented an idea like a witch, it just has this enormous power because it's a very useful idea. If you can identify your enemies or people that you just don't like very much or don't approve of as being some kind of demonic scapegoat, actually, that's quite handy for you if you want to wield certain kinds of power. So I look at the way that the word witch morphs and changes over time and the way that the witch trial morphs and changes. So in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, people would say quite readily, of course, we don't believe in the idea of witchcraft. But funnily enough, quite often there were trials where people were pitted against each other for political or social reasons or reasons of sexual transgression or fraud or theft or something like that. And into that adversarial situation, somebody would drop the word witch.
Yeah.
And immediately it would just, transform the trial process. So there are a number of cases where people are not accused of witchcraft, and everybody is very keen to say, no, we're not accusing them of witchcraft. But nevertheless, they are a deadly enemy of society. And oh, look, they also happen to have all this magical paraphernalia, or, they happen to have had a history as a Satanist, or they happen to be a spiritualist medium who perhaps is a fraud, or perhaps is somebody who does believe in what she is doing. But nevertheless, we must find her and punish her because she's some kind of heretic, some kind of witch. So I think it's really interesting the way the word witch moves around, and it keeps popping up in situations where people are being put through some sort of trial by the society around them, and where they've been identified as completely undesirable, some kind of scapegoat.
I think it's important to say, as you do in the book, that many people still believe in the literal existence of witches. One of the things you mentioned is that as Christianity expands throughout the globe, that missionaries took with them this demonological image of the witch, whether they wanted to or not. So the idea, the literal idea, not a metaphorical notion of, for a witch, the literal idea of a witch persists, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does. And again, this is a profoundly sad thing, isn't it? So as Christian missionaries go around the world, again, often with the best of intentions, bringing healthcare and education, all the things that they believe to be good things in their wake, one of the things they take with them is this binary identification of God's good people over here and the devil's bad people over there. And I think that is partly responsible for the massive upsurge in witch trials around the world today. Since the 1990s, thousands of people all across the world have been killed as witches. And that's sometimes in a formal state trial, but far more often it's in some kind of informal community justice lynching, murder, whatever you want to call it. And quite often it is driven by Christian religion. And it's a version of religion which has been brought into that community sometime in the past, often as far back as the 19th century, and has spread and changed and has merged with local beliefs, some of which already had the idea of witches in them. But, the people there were not holding mass witch trials at the time, as far as we can tell. And yet today there are mass witch trials, and they're happening all across southern Africa. They happen in Indian communities, they happen in Nepal, they happen in Indonesia. And it looks awfully like the witch trials of the 15th to 18th century that happened in Europe and North America. Of course there are important differences. But I think it's also important to link up those two ideas and have a look at them and see what's changed and what hasn't changed. And I think one of the things that hasn't changed is that human propensity to create scapegoats, to identify groups who ought to be persecuted. And I think that's what's going on in contemporary witch trials today. I think we ought to be doing more about it.
So this may surprise some people. It certainly sort of surprised me. But the one of the last chapters in the book, you mention a tweet sent by Donald Trump on January 10th. This is 2017. Witch hunt. Those were the words. And you say, he went on to tweet witch hunt, usually in capitals, as you point out, 379 times during his 4-year presidency, which amounts to at least one tweet per week. What is going on? How do you make sense of that? Bringing Donald Trump into the question of witchcraft in North America.
Yes. Well, I kind of think he brought himself. It was a very interesting phrase to choose, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it wasn't something that I noticed right away. As a British person, I didn't really come across this. But of course, when he became president, these tweets were incredibly frequent, as you say, and people started across the world to pick up the idea that if somebody was attacking you politically, or was saying that you committed a crime, or was saying that you'd done something corrupt, or whatever it was they were alleging against you, you could brush this off by using the words witch hunt. And I thought that was utterly fascinating. It kind of rehabilitated the word witch, I think, and the idea of the witch hunt, and it made us notice it more, and it made politicians in other countries, so politicians in Britain started using this phrase as well. And it certainly made me think about what we meant by the word witch. Now, I think what he means is an entirely innocent person being persecuted by malign forces. But in many ways, he's much more like a witch hunter than he is like a witch from the past. You know, he's not female, he's not poor, he's not being scapegoated for reasons of, you know, religious heresy or some kind of moral offence that, you know, we actually don't mind in our communities, but is used as a tool against somebody. He's not being treated in the ways that I think women were in the 16th and 17th century across Europe and North America. So how is he like a witch? And he thinks that he's like a witch because he's being persecuted and scapegoated. But is that actually so? And what do we feel about somebody using the word witch in those circumstances? I really wanted readers to think about what they felt when they saw the phrase witch hunt, and who they thought a witch might be and who they thought wouldn't be a witch, and what they meant by it. And then, if you think about somebody as a witch, well, who's the witch hunter then? Who are the witch hunters in contemporary society? If we do still have witch trials, then who is putting the witches on trial, and why are they doing it, and how do we feel about that?
I think it brings us finally to something you say right at the end of the book, where you ask the question, okay, what can you do? What can we do about all of this? And one of the things you mentioned is like get educated, do some reading, pay attention. As you say, notice, for example, when female politicians or activists are being called witches, and really think about why that's still happening. I guess this gets to the thing that you were saying a moment ago. You want us to think more about this stuff and take it more seriously, I guess.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I mean, certainly at the start of my career, I thought this was a problem from history. And the more I have seen, particularly in recent times with the use of phrases like that one, witch hunt, the more I thought this is incredibly relevant. And we do need to pay more attention. We do need to read. We need to read more history. We need to understand the history of the idea of the witch hunt, the witch trial, the word witch. And maybe we should pay more attention when we see something that is being described as a witch hunt now or looks to us like a witch trial. Because often that is the scapegoating of vulnerable people. So, yeah, I would like people to read more about witchcraft. I would like people to think more about people who are being accused of witchcraft today. Maybe just do some research online. Look at communities in Africa or Indonesia where this is happening. Think about why it's happening. What can we do? Can we donate to charities who, for example, help people accused of witchcraft? Can we intervene in a debate in our neighbourhood where we think somebody's being ill-treated and just try to calm tensions down a little bit? I do think there are things that we could do which would make the world less prone to witch hunting, if you like, and I think that would be a good thing.
Marion Gibson, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Marion Gibson, she's a professor of Renaissance and Magical Literatures at the University of Exeter. Her latest book is Witchcraft, A History in 13 Trials. We'll put a link to it on our webpage. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. You can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. Program produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Kerry Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.